there is something to be said about the harder reading. Now we're gonna come to this kind of canon of textual criticism, and what's interesting about that is that this isn't really applied to this verse, to 2 Thessalonians 2:2, and the harder reading is basically what text criticism says. Essentially, modern text criticism says, well, you prefer the reading that's harder, whether it appears to be a factual error, or whether it appears to be a grammatical mistake, or if it's just something just really strange, but there seems to be some possibility of it being. We prefer the harder reading. Now, what is the harder reading in this sense, right? And of course, when you take a look through the scriptures, you find that the day of the Lord, the phrase "day of the Lord," is a theme all throughout the scriptures, Old Testament right up into the New. Now, you keep in mind here too that Paul himself, he would have been like, he knows the scriptures. Now, they didn't have like TV or video games or anything to keep them occupied. So Paul, he was in the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures, day in and day out. He knew what the Old Testament said. And I don't know how many times he would have read "day of the Lord, day of the Lord, day of the Lord" in Hebrew or in Greek or maybe in Latin. I don't know if it would have been Latin or not. But he would have been absolutely "day of the Lord." So when it comes to copying the manuscripts, chances are that the term "day of the Lord" is probably more in the mind of the scribes when they are writing these things down. And so when you see "day of the," fill it in, "day of the Lord." Nobody's going to put "day of Christ." It's just such a small thing. Like when you take "day of Christ," I think the phrase "day of Christ" only appears in one other place. That one phrase only appears in one other place. Now, we have "day of Jesus Christ" and we have "day of our Lord Jesus Christ," and we're going to take a look at those passages. But it's more likely that, a scribe coming to see "day of the" is going to put "Lord" instead of Christ, perhaps even, without even really thinking about it. They'll just write it down. A great example I have of this is in my own communication. So I used to work at a large insurance company, and if anyone's here who has worked for a corporation, email is like the communication method. And so you type in your emails and you ask for your requests, and then if you get really mad at somebody, you say "as per last email," But I worked with this guy named Chris. And I needed to request some sort of access to a database or something. I can't remember exactly what it was. So I wrote, "Hey, Chris, can I get blah, 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 blah." But I have written so much the name Christ that I cannot help but put the T on the end of the name Chris. It happens all the time. I type Chris and it's like muscle memory. I just automatically hit the T when I'm typing it in there. It's in there. It's in my brain. So the lady who responded, it was I was asking some lady for Chris to do this thing because that's how organizations work. And she just responded and said, "Well, yeah, it is close to Christmas, isn't it?" But you can see, just in that one instance, it was in my brain, and I have to work really, really hard to not put the T when I'm writing down the name Chris or when I'm typing it. Either or, it just comes automatically. I have to really put effort into it. And so there's a sense in which you could argue that the same thing is sort of happening here. When a scribe writes "day of the," right? Or what is it? He mara tu Kyriou, right? That's what you're going to write, "the day of the Lord," instead of "he mara tu Christou." So it's, I would say that the harder reading is going to be "day of Christ." So even though the great unseals, right, have "day of the Lord," the majority, the Byzantine, 85% of our manuscripts have "day of Christ." Like that, this is the way to go. So I can explain how "day of Christ" turned into "day of the Lord, but it would be much more difficult to explain how "day of the Lord" had been changed into "day of Christ."